Oppression of certain ethnic groups has been a long-lasting problem in the United States. Back in the 1850s, the Chinese experienced political unrest and a lack of economic opportunity, pushing them to migrate to the United States. As the number of Chinese immigrants increased, American citizens began to use them as a scapegoat for their problems, blaming them for wage declines and economic ills. This created an anti-Chinese sentiment and ultimately led to the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which temporarily prohibited Chinese immigration. The similar idea that can be seen today is legislation that prohibits specific groups from entering the United States for reasons with little support. For example, today, immigrants and refugees are seen as the reason for crime and terrorist activity in the United States. This idea has little support, but it is widely believed. In fact, refugees were responsible for only 3 deaths in terrorist attacks, and all 3 occurred in the 1970s. No Syrian refugees were responsible, yet they are the group targeted against in Trump's current legislation. This shows that the idea of discriminating against certain groups for unjust reasons has been around before and is still present today. During the 1920s, many United States citizens feared those who were foreign-born as they were thought to be communist. This phenomenon became known as the Red Scare. The widespread belief that anyone who was foreign-born was communist created many problems for immigrants. One example is the Palmer raids, led by Attorney General Palmer, in which alleged communists were captured and detained. The problem with this was that they were often deported without a fair trial. The Palmer raids further increased nativism, which led to the passing of the Immigration Acts of 1921 and 1924. The primary purpose of these acts was to restrict the number of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. There were 2 main arguments made against immigration from these parts of Europe. American citizens believed that they were taking their jobs and threatening their national security. Ironically, these same 2 arguments are still prevalent today, almost 100 years later, just with different immigrant ethnicities.
Following the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor, fear drove discrimination to turn towards all Japanese American citizens. This fear pressured the Roosevelt administration to pass the Executive Order of 9066, which required all Japanese to leave the West Coast. The head of each family was to report to the Civil Control Station, where they are informed what they were allowed to bring. The list was simple: bed sheets, utensils, a few clothes, and toiletries. Nothing else would be allowed. People lost their property, their homes, and were often separated from their families, especially if the children were American-born, commonly called Nisei. Earlier in 1945, some Japanese American citizens were allowed to return to the West Coast, but it wasn't until March 1946 that the last camp closed. If you survived and were still alive in 1988, Congress rewarded you with $20,000 as payment for the violation of your liberties. Around the same times of the Japanese internment camps, the United States was also facing another crisis, the Great Depression. It was a hard time for people, which eventually led them to search for blame and turn on one another. Around 1/4 of Americans were out of jobs, and they decided that it was the Mexican Americans' fault for taking their jobs. This eventually led to 2 million Mexicans and Mexican Americans being deported. Federal, state, and local officials started the repatriation campaigns that were basically raids that attacked and deported anyone that even looked like they were of Mexican descent. These raids were even encouraged by General William Dill of the Hoover administration. One of the most famous raids was the Placida raid downtown in LA. They captured individuals from hospitals and tuberculosis sanatoriums, threw them in trucks, and drove them over the border. According to the Journal of Emma Gomez Martinez, who was a Mexican-American teenager at the time living in LA, she remembered being shopping one day when she saw caravans of Mexican families being driven away.
September 11, 2001 in New York City, a Muslim terrorist group called Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 planes and killed nearly 3,000 people, making it the worst terrorist attack in the United States history. Since then, Muslims have been targeted and discriminated against for being terrorists. Due to this event, the immigration policy is changing drastically with the Homestead Security Act and the Enhanced Border Security and Visa Entry Reform Act of 2002. The president wants to sign a bill designed to halt the resettlement of Syrian and Iraq refugees to the United States. This law would discriminate against dual nations of Iran, Iraq, Sudan, and Syria. He also wants to tighten controls in the visa waiver program. Over the past years, more than 18,000 Muslims have been deported and 15,000 Muslims have been detained or arrested and targeted as terrorists. With Trump's actions, this number will only increase.
This issue is still prevalent in 2017 as the United States continues to struggle with the acceptance of some ethnicities. American citizens of specific races are discriminated against and denied the rights of equality promised to every American citizen. For example, every American is promised a fair trial, but for immigrants, this is not the case.
Currently, under the Trump administration, all citizens who are not American-born are facing these discrimination issues. The government is intensifying immigration into the United States, and it's making it much harder to become an American citizen. Immigration agents are now not allowed to remove anyone from the United States who has committed a crime, regardless of how minor it is or if they have a criminal record.
The Trump administration is looking to add 15,000 enforcement agents. With all of these additional agents, the amount of citizens getting deported is only going to increase.
As most people probably know, Donald Trump has tried to pass an executive order that would implement a travel ban focusing on predominantly Muslim countries such as Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Somalia. According to the Trump administration, this ban can be credited to the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952.
The act states as follows: whenever the president finds that the entry of any aliens or any class of aliens into the United States would be detrimental to the interest of the United States, he may, by proclamation and for such period as he shall deem necessary, suspend the entry of all aliens or any class of aliens as immigrants or non-immigrants, or impose on the entry of aliens any restrictions he may deem to be inappropriate.
Unfortunately, straying from America's identity of the land of the free due to fear and racial profiling is not something new to the nation. In the past, Muslims, African Americans, Japanese, Chinese, and Hispanics have been targeted through legislation or the acts of American citizens. There is no one solution to the targeting of specific ethnic groups in terms of immigration due to the complexity of this issue. However, there are many actions that could be taken to help lessen the targeting of these groups. One would be to simply revert back to the old immigration policy, which was rigorous enough. This was a multi-step process that involved background checks by multiple government agencies such as the FBI and CIA. Individuals would have to provide birth, marriage, and other records, do an interview, and a full medical exam. These records and background checks would often be a lengthy process, taking anywhere from a couple of months to a couple of years. This shows that the old process immigrants had to go through was plenty rigorous enough. More stipulations are not necessary, especially when the old policy is effective at keeping terrorists out of the United States. In fact, out of the 700,000 immigrants allowed into the U.S. under this policy, only 3 were arrested on charges of terrorism, and these arrests were for terrorist plots that would have taken place off of U.S. soil. Implementing a new policy might stop these 3, but is it really worth taking the chance of a better life for the other 699,997 immigrants?
Another measure that could be taken would be to reinstate DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Children of this program are called Dreamers and have to meet specific criteria. The main criteria are that they come to the United States before their 16th birthday and have resided here since 2007 while maintaining school enrollment and having no criminal record. If these requirements are met, these children may request consideration of deferred action for a period of 2 years, subject to renewal, and become eligible for work authorization. With Trump's current plan, the lives of more than 728,000 Dreamers that the federal government says have been approved for DACA are in a fragile state. By reinstating DACA, these children would be allowed to stay in the United States and become productive members of society. Not only would this help them, but it would also help our economy as well, which is why this measure should strongly be considered.
A final action that could be taken would be to increase awareness and acceptance of other cultures with education. By educating people on their prejudiced attitudes, the hope is that they can be changed. A study by Laurie Rudman, Richard Ashmore, and Melvin Gary in 2001 showed that this is possible. They found that the students who had enrolled in a prejudice and conflict seminar showed significant reductions in their levels of prejudice. With education on different cultures and how they are treated, prejudiced attitudes towards them can be greatly reduced, if not eliminated.